As the world goes electric, there's a real danger that ICE engine dinosaurs will have no further part to play. But there is a small company based near Oxford that thinks differently. Electrogenic is working hard to bring these ancient beasts into a new age, replacing their archaic powertrains with something a little more up to date. This is one of their latest efforts. The Electrogenic 356 is based on the 1965 original, the grandfather of the 911. It once used a 1.6-litre Boxer 4 internal combustion engine, but that's now been replaced with an electric motor. However, this is no ordinary engine swap. This 356 stands proud as being one of only a handful of electric cars to use a manual gearbox.
Look at this. I'm changing gear in an electric car. That just completely fries my egg. Fourth, down to third, into a corner, send it round. Oh my God, hit the brakes. Into second. That is so weird. I'm used to one continuous surge of power in electric cars, but in this, I'm rowing up and down the box at will by myself. And that's because this car uses the same 4-speed transmission that you got in the original Porsche 356. Honestly, whoever said electric cars couldn't be engaging, I'm sorry, you're gonna have to think again. Talk about driver involvement. Knob gang, stand up.
If you're wondering how this is even possible, well, if you ask Electrogenic, it's all very simple. They start with the body of a classic, in this case an authentic 356C, the last of its kind. Next, they strip out the fuel tank and 1.6-litre 95 horsepower pushrod boxer at the rear, replacing it all with electric components. At the heart of it, a Hyper 9 motor making 80 kilowatts or 120 horsepower and 235 newton meters of torque. This is what's connected to the original 4-speed gearbox. The motor has been fitted with a top hat that marries it to the flywheel. This is connected to friction and pressure plates in the clutch, followed by a custom-designed adapter that allows it all to be fitted to the original gearbox. It's very much a case of old school meets new school.
This car obviously doesn't make the same sort of noise that the original 356 made. So you don't get that roar from the engine. You don't get that sound as the car splutters into life when you turn the ignition key. However, I wouldn't say it's silent, not by any stretch of the imagination. Firstly, you hear a few squeaks and a few rattles because, let's face it, it's an old car. But secondly, Electrogenic have chosen to use an electric motor that doesn't have a ridiculously high RPM. Can't believe I'm shifting gears. It only revs to around 8,000 RPM, which means that as you reach the red line, I'm talking about red lines in an EV, it does start to make more noise up to a crescendo. And that means that every time you change gear, you feel and hear this car making more and more sound. And that encourages you to roll up and down the box. That gives you a better sense of involvement. It might seem like quite a strange meeting of two very different worlds, but I think it happens to work. I love the fact that it's still rear-wheel drive, just like the 356. It's still rear-engined, just like the 356. And it's also air-cooled, just like the 356. I haven't always been a fan of this generation of Porsche. It does look like a Beetle from a lot of angles, particularly in the bonnet and the headlights and the front bumper. But there's a lot to like about this car. For example, the gold Porsche lettering, beautiful. You might also notice it's got twin exhausts, which are left over from the original car, which they couldn't remove because it's part of the rear bumper assembly. Not even Mercedes can top that level of fakery.
Regarding batteries, the 356 wasn't designed to accommodate any, but Electrogenic has managed to squeeze them in every spare nook and cranny they could find, including under the floor at the rear, behind the rear seats, and in the bonnet at the front. In total, the battery has a 36 kilowatt-hour capacity that's apparently good for 140 miles. A 15 kilowatt onboard charger should give you a full recharge in around 2.5 hours.
The interior is very special as well. It looks pretty much spotless. It looks like it just rolled off the production line. It's so clean. I particularly love this red on the dashboard, the red leather on the seats, and the matching red on the carpets and on the door cards. Something else I find really interesting is that even though it's an electric car, it's still got the original manual wind down windows, which is a bit odd. It's also got this little quarter panel here for letting a bit of breeze into the car, which is quite a sweet little touch, I think. It's also got all the original gauges, which have been modified to work with the new electrical systems. So your fuel tank is related to the amount of battery power you have left. The rev counter is wired up to the motor, so that tells you how fast the motor's spinning. And obviously you've also got your speedo on the right-hand side. It's also got the original Blaupunkt stereo system, the original clock. And if I pull this, that operates the windscreen wipers. Very cute. Look at that. You know what that is, children? Never learned, but I'll give you a clue. It goes with that little ashtray thing in the center. Very nice. Obviously, it's also got the pièce de résistance, a 4-speed manual gearbox, 3 pedals, which is very weird. And also, if you notice, it's got this little lever at the front. If you push that forward, the car's ready to go forward. If you pull it backwards, it goes backwards. Or if you leave it in the middle, then it goes into neutral. And interestingly, when you rev it, listen, it spins the motor. It works just like an internal combustion engine. If I hit the brake, it slows it down too. It's all very quirky and interesting. What I want to know though is how Electrogenic's decision to electrify this car have affected the way that it drives. You can drive this car in a couple of ways. You can either leave it in third gear, as I am now, and let the car do its thing. You get a decent amount of acceleration and it will keep going up to motorway speeds essentially. Or you can choose to take matters into your own hands, and using the gearbox essentially allows you to choose exactly how much torque is sent to the rear wheels. So, for example, I'll slow right down for you right now and I'll put it into first gear. And if I pull away, what you'll notice is that I get a really good surge of acceleration before I hit the red line. Alternatively, I just realized there's no headrest, so your head does get smashed back towards the back of the car. But alternatively, if I put it into, let's say, fourth gear, for argument's sake, and then I accelerate, nothing, it bogs down. That's flat to the floor. So there's a big difference, back to third, between fourth, third, second, and first. It's like driving a proper internal combustion engine car. This makes all the difference. There's actually a fair amount of skill involved in changing gear as well, because even though you don't have to feather the clutch, you can just basically lift off. If you have too many engine revs on, too many motor revs, then the car complains, it shudders. Equally, if you downshift when you've got too many revs on, the car doesn't like that either. It won't explode, for example, but there is an art to getting your gear changes right. There's driver involvement in this thing, trust me. You might have noticed that this car doesn't have the same ridiculous headline power figures as the likes of a Tesla or a Porsche Taycan, for example. But Electrogenic say that it doesn't matter. What's really important in a car like this is torque, and there's bags of it. When you accelerate, you really do feel it shift. And trust me, I'm not sure you'd want more power in this particular chassis. The steering is very interesting. It's not power assisted, which means that there's a lot of weight in this, even when you're up to speed. And that means that you're constantly having to wrestle the car around corners. And believe me, it's a bit of a workout. Also, you might have noticed these seats, A, don't have any head restraints, but B, don't have any side supports. So this track is predominantly right-handers, and that means that I'm constantly being shoved up against this window here, praying begging and hoping that this door doesn't fly open because there's only a lap belt. The chassis is really nicely balanced. They've managed to lay the batteries out in such a way that this car has a 60-40 weight distribution, which is pretty similar to the original 356. It might be a bit heavier than the original, but I'm certainly having a lot of fun in this car. Way more than I thought I would in the beginning. The tires are a little bit sketchy, I must say. It's using the original rubber that the 356 first came on, and that means that it's a little bit more unpredictable through the corners. It moves a bit more, although I actually prefer that. I wouldn't want this thing to have cup twos, for example, where there's way more grip than you have the power and torque to overcome. The 356 uses disc brakes, so they stop the car nicely. The first 2 inches or so of travel essentially do nothing, I would say, and then they firm up quite dramatically, but they do stop the car. But there is no regen. I lift off the brakes and it rolls, it coasts like you would expect an internal combustion engine car to do. And I actually prefer that, especially in a sports car, because one pedal driving is okay around town, but out on a racetrack, for example, or when you're driving enthusiastically, it's not what you want, believe me. It's not what I want. So, should you buy one of these? I mean, if you're in the market for an electric car that is fun to drive, really, really engaging, the answer's got to be absolutely. It's not going to come cheap though. First, you have to find a donor car, and 356s aren't exactly inexpensive. And then the cost of swapping the ICE engine out for electrical components is going to run you somewhere in the region of 30 to 50,000 pounds, depending on how much power, what speed of recharging you want, and a load of other factors. So, not the cheapest thing in the world, but my God, it is hilarious.
You could argue that this conversion is slightly sacrilegious, unnecessary even, but I can see the advantages. Classics such as this in their original form are notoriously unreliable. They break down, they need lots of TLC, and are simply not ideal for day-to-day use. With an electric powertrain, you go some way to making a machine that's usable year-round on any trip. Food for thought.
This car shows without a shadow of a doubt that electric vehicles don't have to be boring, that's number one. But the second thing is, they don't have to rely on outrageous power and torque and straight line speed in order to be interesting. There's a whole world out there in which you can have fun in an electric car where it's enjoyable and engaging and fun to drive. And I wish more manufacturers would just take risks like this. Companies, please whack a manual transmission on your electric car. People will love it. This single-handedly, I think, will convince people around the world who are skeptical about EVs that they're a lot of fun to drive.